Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
They always said I'd end up broke, bitter, and alone, just like Aunt Peggy, who talks to her cats and drinks boxed wine by noon. That was the punchline in our house. I was the punchline. It didn't matter what I did or said. Somehow I was always the one they circled back to with a laugh, a smirk, a shake of the head that said, "There she goes again." You'd think I burned the house down or robbed a bank the way they treated me, but I was just different. Quiet, observant, always thinking too much and saying too little, and for some reason, that made me the freak. The problem child. The family joke. My sister Kara? She was the golden girl, the center of every spotlight, the kind of person who didn't just walk into a room. She arrived, soaking in every ounce of attention like it was her birthright. Perfect skin, perfect smile, perfect grades. Daddy's little angel, Mama's pride, Grandma's favorite. She could have kicked a puppy and they'd still say it must have done something to deserve it. And then there was me, standing in the shadows, watching them all orbit around her as if she was the sun and I was just some speck of dust floating nearby. I remember being 10 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with a drawing I'd worked on for hours. It was a weird little invention I made up in my head, a kind of folding bicycle that could turn into a backpack. I was proud of it. It was creative, maybe even a little clever. I showed it to my mom, my heart thudding in my chest, hoping just maybe this time she'd look at me the way she looked at Kara after her dance recitals. She barely glanced at the paper before laughing. What is this supposed to be? A transformer with a flat tire. Then Kara chimed in from the hallway. Maybe she's drawing her future job, riding a broken bike to her minimum wage gig. That was the moment it clicked for me. Not just that they didn't believe in me, but that they didn't even see me. I was background noise to their performance. They weren't interested in who I was becoming because they had already decided who I was, a screw-up in training, a future disappointment with a front-row seat to their success. It only got worse with age. High school was a minefield. Kara was prom queen and homecoming princess, 2 years in a row, because apparently life really does play favorites. Every teacher I had would say, "You're Kara's sister, right?" Wow, she was such a joy to have in class. I'd nod, fake a smile, and die a little inside every time. No one ever said I was a joy. Hell, half the time I wasn't even a name, just the other one. By the time I was 17, the family had developed this tradition of passive-aggressive humor, always at my expense. If I cooked dinner, they'd joke about checking the smoke detectors. If I mentioned college, they'd ask if I was planning to major in sleeping late and taking bad selfies. Uncle Frank, God bless his drunk, leathery soul, once slurred across the table at Thanksgiving, "We should start a pool to bet what job she'll fail at first." My money's on dog walker, but for squirrels. Everyone laughed. Even my dad, who rarely cracked a smile, chuckled while chewing turkey. I remember sitting there, pretending to laugh too, just so I wouldn't cry in front of them. You might think I was bitter back then, and maybe I was. But more than anything, I was just quietly absorbing every moment, every insult, every condescending glance. I didn't push back. I didn't fight. I didn't scream, "Screw you, I'll show you all." I just listened. And I learned. I learned exactly how people hide cruelty under the mask of humor. I learned how easy it is to ignore someone until it's convenient to remember them. And I learned that sometimes the smartest thing you can do is keep your mouth shut and build your escape route in silence. I wasn't perfect, not even close. I made mistakes, I doubted myself, I took hits I didn't deserve. But every time they pushed me down, I tucked away a little more fire inside me. Every joke became a spark. Every insult, a brick in the foundation of something bigger. They thought they were shaping me into nothing. But they were just giving me the blueprint to build everything. They thought I was stupid. That I'd never amount to anything. That I was destined to be some washed-up disappointment crashing on couches and borrowing gas money from Kara's husband. But there's something they never noticed. I was listening. And I was learning. By the time I hit 22, life looked exactly the way my family had always expected it to, barely getting by, juggling 2 jobs that drained the life out of me. eating cheap takeout from dented containers while sitting on a couch that smelled faintly of mildew and disappointment. I was renting a shoebox apartment above a laundromat, where the floors creaked loud enough to startle me awake at night, and the walls were so thin I could hear the guy next door snore through his dreams. Kara, on the other hand, was busy smiling on magazine covers, sipping champagne in rooftop bars, posing next to men with Rolexes and veneers, while my mother practically carried a photo album of her accomplishments like a traveling exhibit. It didn't matter what Kara did. She could have farted in a silk dress, and my parents would have called it art. Meanwhile, I could have discovered a cure for insomnia, and they'd still ask why I hadn't done something serious with my life. I remember one Christmas, my dad handed me a $20 bill like it was a charitable donation and said, "Get yourself something nice, kiddo." Kara, on the other hand, got diamond earrings, a weekend spa package, and a goddamn toast from the dinner table about how proud they were of her. I don't even think they noticed I didn't say a word that whole night. I just sat there chewing my dry turkey, wondering how many more years I'd have to pretend it didn't sting. But behind all that, behind the burned coffee at the diner job, behind the warehouse shifts that left my hands raw and my back aching, I had something they didn't know about. A tiny fire flickering in the background, quiet and stubborn. I was watching YouTube tutorials on my cracked second-hand laptop while folding towels at 2 in the morning. I was reading blogs about digital marketing during my bus rides, studying SEO while half asleep on my mattress on the floor. I didn't understand everything at first. I clicked on videos and paused them every 30 seconds just to write things down I didn't understand, only to Google them later. I felt stupid half the time, but I kept going anyway, because it was the only thing in my life that felt like movement, like purpose. There were nights when I sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by scribbled notes, coffee-stained printouts, and stacks of cheap inventory I couldn't even afford to ship yet. I taught myself how to code enough to build a rickety little website. I figured out how to source materials from overseas without getting scammed. I learned how to write copy that actually made people click and buy. It was messy and slow, and more than once I cried into my hands at 3 in the morning thinking I was delusional, thinking maybe my family was right all along. But then something shifted. One night, after months of tinkering, I listed a few handmade items online. Nothing fancy, just some jewelry pieces I'd made by hand, minimalist and simple, but with a kind of quiet elegance that I hoped someone out there might notice. I posted them on a basic shop page with a clumsy product description and zero expectations. I went to sleep that night fully convinced nothing would happen, that it would sit there untouched, just like everything else I ever tried. But the next morning, something was different. I woke up groggy, still wearing my diner uniform, and opened my phone out of habit. My email was flooded. Notifications. Orders. Questions. I thought it was a glitch. I refreshed the page 3 times before it sunk in. People were buying. Dozens of people. Then hundreds. I remember just sitting there on the edge of my mattress, staring at the screen while my heart pounded in my chest like a drumline. I didn't laugh. I didn't scream. I just sat still, wide-eyed, because in that moment I realized something had cracked open, not just in the world, but inside me. Have you ever felt like everyone counted you out before you even had a chance? Like no matter what you did, your family already wrote your ending for you? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear your stories. I want to know what you did with all the weight they threw on your back. Because sometimes, when people think you're nothing, you get the rare freedom of becoming anything. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I went to work like nothing had changed. I took my diner tips, mopped the same greasy floors, smiled through the same fake conversations. But in my pocket was the buzzing pulse of something electric, something real and rising. I packed every single order by hand that first week, printed labels using a borrowed printer from my neighbor, and rode the bus with a trash bag full of packages on my lap like some sad Santa Claus on a budget. And still, I said nothing to my family. They didn't ask, and I didn't offer. They were too busy asking Kara about her latest brand deal and whether she'd picked a venue for her engagement party. I just nodded and smiled and kept folding laundry at night. But inside me, something was blooming, and it was only just beginning. I remember that night more clearly than almost anything else in my life, because shame has a way of sticking to your bones, crawling under your skin and building a nest there. It was one of those forced family dinners, the kind that makes your stomach knot before you even walk through the front door. The house smelled like overcooked garlic bread and cheap wine, the same way it always did when my mother was trying too hard to make everything look perfect, and I already knew exactly how the evening would play out before I even took off my coat. Kara would dazzle everyone with her stories about modeling shoots and celebrity parties. My mother would beam like she was living vicariously through her, and I would be asked about my life only out of politeness, just enough to check a box, not enough to actually listen. We were halfway through dinner, plates still cluttered with soggy salad and congealing lasagna, when my father turned to me with that familiar half-smile he always wore when he was about to pretend he cared. "So, what's new with you?" he asked, not even looking up from his fork. I hesitated, more out of habit than uncertainty, because I already knew nothing I said would be taken seriously. But something in me, something that had been growing slowly in the shadows of their disregard, decided to speak up that night. "I've been working on something," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "A business, actually. I've started building a little online store," and before I could even finish the sentence, Kara snorted, actually snorted, into her wine glass. "A business," she said, eyes wide with mock concern. "Like a real one? Or is this one of your weird little craft hobbies again?" The table erupted in laughter, and I felt every bit of it land like a slap across my face. My dad shook his head and chuckled under his breath. "Let's not get our hopes up, honey," he said, as if I'd announced I was planning to launch a spaceship from the backyard. Even my mom couldn't help herself. "Sweetie, maybe it's better to focus on finding a nice steady job first," she said in that patronizing tone that always made me feel 6 years old again. "You've never been the entrepreneurial type, and that's okay. Not everyone needs to be a boss babe." I wanted to disappear into the floor. I wanted to scream. But mostly, I wanted to remember exactly how this moment felt, because somewhere deep in my gut, I knew I was going to need that feeling later. I didn't argue. I didn't try to defend myself or explain the hours I'd spent building the website, sourcing materials, learning how to run ads and optimize listings. I just nodded, smiled politely, and swallowed the rage like a bitter pill. But something snapped into place that night, not broken, not shattered, but sharpened. Something inside me caught fire, and this time it didn't fizzle out. I went home, opened my laptop, and registered my LLC that same night, while their laughter still echoed in my ears. I didn't even know what I was doing, not really, but I knew I had to start somewhere. I chose a name, bought the domain, and printed out my certificate the next morning like it was a declaration of war they didn't even know I'd launched. From that point on, everything changed, not fast, not dramatically, but like a slow, rumbling shift in the earth beneath my feet. I started treating my work like a real business, not a side hustle, not a hobby, not a secret shame. I reinvested every dollar I made back into the company. I took online courses, taught myself graphic design, figured out how to run social media campaigns, and learned from every single failure. I started building relationships with suppliers, negotiating deals, tracking analytics, and slowly, steadily, building something that was no longer just a dream but a living, breathing machine. Then came the big one, a corporate order that changed everything. I remember the email so vividly because I read it 5 times before I believed it was real. A mid-sized company in Chicago had stumbled across one of my product listings and wanted a bulk order, not 10, not 50, but 10,000 units. The invoice totaled over $100,000. I sat there in silence for almost an hour, just staring at the screen, wondering how the hell I had gotten from folding towels in a shitty apartment to negotiating a 6-figure deal. But I didn't celebrate publicly. I didn't post anything on social media. I didn't text anyone. I still walked into family dinners wearing the same old clothes, nodding quietly when they asked how things were going, offering the same vague answer, "I'm doing okay," because I didn't want to prove them wrong with words. I wanted them to choke on their own assumptions when the time came. I wanted to let the silence speak for itself. It's a strange thing, watching the world begin to notice you just as the people who were supposed to know you best continue to act like you're invisible. There was a point where the orders stopped being manageable by just my two hands, and I had to make the decision to scale, to trust other people with the thing I'd built in silence and sweat. I remember standing in a small, bare warehouse on the edge of town, signing a lease I could barely afford, heart pounding so loud it echoed in my ears, thinking to myself, this is either the dumbest thing I've ever done or the beginning of something too big to even understand yet. Turns out it was the latter. Somewhere between the third production run and the fifth new hire, my little brand stopped being little. It didn't happen in one dramatic explosion, but in 100 small moments that added up like compound interest. A celebrity stylist tagged one of our pieces in a viral video without even contacting us, and suddenly my inbox was a war zone: orders, inquiries, interview requests, bulk requests from international retailers. I didn't scream, I didn't even smile much, I just kept working, quietly and relentlessly, because success had never been about glitter to me, it was about freedom. And the sweeter part was knowing that while they were busy laughing, I was building something they couldn't even begin to imagine. I hired a team, trained them from scratch, built systems that ran smoother than anything I'd seen in the jobs I'd worked before. I signed deals with major department stores, started handling international logistics, built relationships with suppliers on 3 continents. Investors started circling like hawks, not the sleazy ones that tried to take everything, but serious people who respected the numbers and didn't care about my last name or my resume. Still, I kept my life small, intentional, quiet. I didn't buy a flashy car or lease some glass-walled condo with a view of the skyline. I didn't post my wins on Instagram with dramatic captions or show off fancy dinners with overpriced cocktails. I still rode the same scratched-up sedan, wore the same comfortable sneakers, and drank the same grocery store coffee I always had. Because the truth was, I didn't need validation anymore, especially not from strangers on the internet or the same family that used to call me a cautionary tale. Every time I walked into my parents' house, it was like stepping into a time capsule. They'd ask if I was still doing that online thing, like it was a phase, like I was still pushing beads onto string and praying someone would click by now. Kara would glance at me from the side of her glass of wine with that same smug indifference, still seeing me as the quiet shadow of her golden light, not realizing the tides had shifted so violently that if she looked down, she'd see her own reflection in the water below my feet. They didn't know about the warehouse in Nevada or the pop-up in New York. They didn't know about the celebrity endorsements, the 6-figure contracts, the expanding product lines. They didn't know that my brand had become a household name in niches that reached millions. They didn't know that 2 national retailers had offered to buy me out entirely, and I had said no. Because I wasn't done yet. Not even close. And still, I said nothing. I let them ask their half-hearted questions and respond with their bored nods, not realizing they were talking to the CEO of a multi-million-dollar business like she was a failed artist playing pretend on Etsy. I answered with simple words, yeah, things are going okay, and then sat back while they bragged about Kara's latest photoshoot or how her fiancé had just leased a new BMW. There was a strange kind of pleasure in that, not spite, not bitterness, but something colder, quieter, more satisfying than revenge. It was knowing I didn't need them to clap for me anymore. It was knowing that success doesn't always shout. Sometimes it sits in the corner, listening, watching, calculating the perfect moment to let the truth crawl up their spines like a slow shiver. And while they were busy laughing, while they were patting Kara on the back and pretending I wasn't in the room, I was closing a deal that would push our total revenue past $100 million. Not lifetime revenue, just this year. 100 million from something they once called a little hobby. But still, I kept my mouth shut. Because I had a plan, not just to reveal the truth, but to make sure it landed with the full weight it deserved. Not a boast, not a speech, not a confrontation. Something colder. Something sharper. Something they would never forget. Because when you've spent your whole life being underestimated, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is wait until the moment they think they've won, and then drop the truth so heavy it cracks the floor beneath their feet. And I knew exactly when I'd do it. The wedding was everything I'd expected it to be: loud, extravagant, dripping with money and self-importance, a page torn straight out of one of those glossy lifestyle magazines Kara used to model for. The kind where every table setting has a name tag written in cursive gold foil, and the flowers cost more than most people's rent. From the moment I stepped through the doors of that massive country club ballroom, I could already feel what I'd felt every time I walked into a family gathering, like an afterthought, a background prop in someone else's carefully curated fantasy. People were dressed in tailored suits and designer gowns, sipping champagne that had names I couldn't pronounce and talking loudly about mortgages, mutual funds, and their children's private schools. And there I was, sitting quietly at a side table near the back, tucked just far enough away from the action that I might as well have been part of the decor. No one really talked to me, not in any meaningful way, at least. A few polite nods, a couple of fake smiles, a half-hearted, "Hey, it's been a while," followed by awkward silence before they drifted off toward people they actually cared about. My mother floated by once to tell me that my hair looked less unruly than usual and asked if I was still working on my little business thing, in that same dismissive tone she'd used for years, the one that dressed itself up in politeness but couldn't quite hide the condescension underneath. I smiled and told her I was doing fine, then turned back to my glass of water and let her walk away before she could ask anything else. The ceremony had been grand, almost theatrical. Kara in a custom-made dress that sparkled under the chandelier light, her fiancé grinning like a man who'd just won a trophy instead of a partner, and every single person in the room falling over themselves to compliment the happy couple on their fairy tale romance. I clapped at the right times, smiled when expected, and kept my expression neutral, even when Kara's voice dripped with smug satisfaction as she made her vows. But I wasn't there for the ceremony. I wasn't even there for the family. I was there for one single moment, one moment I'd been planning for months, the kind that changes the entire trajectory of a story with just a whisper. When the reception finally started, I waited patiently. I let the toasts roll on, one after another, each speech filled with tired cliches and inside jokes about how perfect Kara had always been, how she'd always been destined for greatness. I watched the way my parents beamed with pride, how every word seemed to validate every awful thing they'd ever said to me, every time they'd told me I wasn't enough, every time they'd laughed at my ambition like it was a bad joke. But I didn't flinch. I didn't scowl. I just waited. And then, when the dancing began and the crowd began to loosen their ties and sip their cocktails a little faster, I walked up to Kara and handed her a simple white envelope. No ribbon, no glitter, no grand presentation, just a plain card, sealed shut, with her name written in small, neat letters on the front. She took it with a forced smile, barely looking at me, already turning her attention back to her bridesmaids before she even opened it. But then she did. And everything around her began to change. I didn't stay to watch her read it. I walked back to my table, sat down, and sipped my drink slowly while the music played and the laughter continued. But within a few minutes, the air in the room began to shift. I felt it before I saw it, that subtle change, like the pressure dropping before a storm. Kara had gone quiet. Her expression had drained of color. Her fingers gripped the card like it was a live wire. And then the whispers started. One person leaned over to another. Then another. People began pulling out their phones, typing furiously, scrolling, searching. I saw my cousin's eyes widen as he read something off his screen. One of Kara's bridesmaids glanced at me from across the room, then back at her phone, then back at me. The murmurs grew louder, confusion turning into curiosity, curiosity bleeding into shock. My parents looked around, clearly sensing something had shifted, but not quite understanding what yet. Kara still stood frozen, holding the card like it might burn her fingers. Inside that card had been just a few lines of text, short, direct, unmistakable. "I wanted to give you something more valuable than anything on your registry. So I bought you this. 50,000 shares of my company. Congrats, sis, from your failure sister. P.S. Google it." That was all it took. I didn't need a mic. I didn't need a speech. I didn't need to throw a drink or raise my voice or make a scene. I just needed a moment. One precise, razor-sharp moment to shift the axis of everything they thought they knew. And as the room began to hum with questions and realizations, as people began piecing it together, as phones lit up with the name of a company they'd heard of but never knew was mine, I sat there in silence and watched the entire narrative unravel. The silence was more deafening than any scream could have been. There was something strange about the way the air felt after everything shifted, not loud, not chaotic, not explosive the way I had once imagined it might be, but eerily still. Like the quiet that settles over a room just after a glass shatters on the floor and everyone freezes, unsure of what to say or how to move. People weren't laughing anymore. Their voices dropped in volume, their eyes darted between their phones and me, and the hum of idle conversation that had filled the room like background noise all evening slowly drained into a tense, uncomfortable quiet. You could practically hear the weight of recognition landing on their shoulders, one by one, as they realized what had just happened, that the invisible girl at the side table, the one they'd dismissed and ignored for years, had just flipped the entire story on its head without raising her voice or lifting a finger. I caught glimpses of my father across the room, his brow furrowed as he stared at his phone screen, reading article after article about a company he never realized was mine, articles about growth metrics, about funding rounds, about industry disruption, about how a woman-led startup had turned an entire market upside down while staying completely under the radar. He looked stunned, as if someone had just told him gravity had changed overnight and the sky was now beneath his feet. A few minutes later, he made his way toward me, awkward and hesitant, the same way he used to walk when he was about to discipline a child, but wasn't quite sure what the offense was yet. He pulled me aside near the hallway, away from the crowd, and for a moment just stood there, wringing his hands and blinking like a man trying to remember how to speak. "I didn't know," he finally said, his voice low and shaky, more unsure than apologetic. "I mean, I didn't realize you were doing all that. I guess I underestimated you." He didn't say sorry. Not really. Not in a way that mattered. It was one of those half-assed acknowledgments people offer when they're not sorry for what they did, only sorry they got caught standing on the wrong side of the story. I nodded politely, said nothing, and stepped past him without another word. My mother didn't approach me at all. She stood near the head table, mouth slightly open, eyes scanning the room like she was still trying to regain control of something that had already slipped through her fingers. She looked like someone trying to remember the lines to a play, only to realize the script had been rewritten and she no longer had a role in it. She didn't say anything, didn't even attempt the kind of fake warmth she usually summoned during events like this. She just stood there, still and wordless, watching me with a face I couldn't quite read, part confusion, part guilt, part something deeper that she probably wouldn't even name if you handed it to her. Kara avoided my eyes for the rest of the night. She didn't come over. She didn't ask questions. She didn't offer a thank you for the gift or even pretend to smile. Her perfect wedding mask had cracked just slightly, enough that the people closest to her could see the tightness in her jaw, the stiff way she held her shoulders, the flicker of something raw behind her polished exterior. I wasn't sure if it was jealousy or shame or just the sting of being outshined on the day she thought was hers alone, but I didn't care enough to dig deeper. I didn't owe her that. I left early, long before the cake cutting or the drunken dancing or the sentimental speeches about love and forever. I slipped out quietly without fanfare, just a subtle nod to the coat check girl and a half smile to the valet. No one tried to stop me. No one called my name. No one noticed, or if they did, they pretended not to. I got in my car, drove away through the dark city streets, and for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not victory, not triumph, but peace. A steady, silent kind of peace that came from knowing I'd said everything I needed to say without ever opening my mouth. A week later, I got a text from my mother. Just 4 words. "Can we talk sometime?" I stared at it for a long time, let it sit on my screen like a question I had already answered in 1,000 different ways over the years. I never replied. Some wounds don't need closing. Some doors don't need reopening. Some silences are sweeter than any apology. And some truths, once revealed, don't need to be repeated. They just echo forever in the space where old lies used to live. And there was one more thing. One final touch, a small act of elegant cruelty wrapped in generosity. A week after the wedding, I made a private donation, $10 million, to a nonprofit that supported underfunded female entrepreneurs, women like me. Women who had been dismissed and disregarded and laughed at until they decided to build empires instead of asking for permission. But I didn't do it in my name. I did it in Kara's. Every press release, every event, every photo op and plaque would bear her name, not mine, a legacy she didn't earn and wouldn't understand, a tribute not to her beauty or charm, but to the success of the sister she spent her life mocking. You don't always have to scream to make noise. Sometimes silence is the loudest revenge.